Good morning and welcome to Rising. It is Monday morning and we've got a great show for you today. We're excited to be here, aren't we, Niall?
We are, after thrilling weekends on both our behalves. What could be better than an early Monday morning?
It's still so cold, though. I am ready for winter to be done and over with. I want to get to summer. I want to get in the pool. I want to go running and rollerblading. I want to participate in outdoor activity.
All these things in good time, Robby.
Yes.
All in good time.
All right, I'm impatient.
But first, what is on your radar?
Happy to tell you, Niall, you're going to like this one. We're all so excited. Oh, joy. MSNBC is axing Joy Reid's show. Now, she has hosted that network's 7 p.m. hour for the past 5 years. Her show, The Readout, is coming to an end this week. That decision was made by Rebecca Cutler, the new president of the network, who has been tasked with rescuing MSNBC's plummeting ratings and dealing with MSNBC's split from NBC. The left-leaning cable channel is currently being split off by its corporate owners, Comcast. Now, the new hosts of the 7 p.m. hour will be Democratic pundit Symone Sanders, former RNC chair Michael Steele, and journalist Alicia Menendez. All three are undoubtedly progressive. While Steele was previously the leader of the Republican Party, that was pre-Trump. In the Trump years, he has become a reliable champion of liberal and anti-Trump causes. I don't know Menendez well. Symone Sanders, on the other hand, is someone I've scrutinized numerous times in the past in terms of her commentary on that network. Now, I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities to criticize them in the future as well, but let's not move on before bidding a fond farewell to Joy Reid, someone who, in my view, evinced so many of the failings of progressive commentary. It should go without saying that she was biased, though in truth, everyone who does the work of being an opinion pundit is in some way biased, so that's not her real problem. The problem is she simply does not understand her enemies, the right, on any level whatsoever. This means her commentary was often wildly off base and pathologically unfair. My favorite Joy Reid quote, by the way, was this one. Education is code for white parents don't like the idea of teaching about race. Dissatisfied with your kid's education? Well, it's probably because you're a racist. Indeed, Joy Reid was obsessed with the idea that everybody she disagreed with was racist or fascist or worse, promoted by Russia. Indeed, Joy Reid was one of the chief enablers, most eager promoters of the Russia collusion hoax, the idea that the Trump campaign worked hand in hand with Russia to steal the 2016 election from Hillary Clinton. Now, that was bad enough, but Joy Reid's commentary became even more unhinged during the pandemic when she served as one of the most pro-mask, pro-lockdown commenters in the country. She shamed people for going to beaches. She tweeted that a picture of people hanging out on a beach in Miami was vile. The beach looked like a disease-ridden petri dish. The picture was actually an old one from 2019, before the pandemic, and her tweet was from March of 2021, a point at which most sane people had determined that, you could safely have fun outside. But nothing tops her most recent election coverage. Before the election, she said not to trust the polls because she thought they were overstating Trump's chances. In fact, she accused Republican-leading pollsters of trying to lay the groundwork for Trump to claim the election was stolen from him once again. Now, we all know how that turned out. Trump won the election and was, if anything, slightly underestimated by the polls. But her post-election coverage was even crazier. She frequently blamed white women, the patriarchy, etc., for failing to vote for Kamala Harris to be president. You know who she refused to blame? Kamala Harris herself. Joy Reid called her campaign flawless. Let's actually watch some of that.
And I think it's important to say that, anyone who has experienced or been in the United States for any period of time and experienced this country's history and knows it cannot have believed that it would be easy to elect a woman president, let alone a woman of color. Let's just be clear. And nothing that was true yesterday about how flawlessly this campaign was run is not true now. I mean, this really was an historic, flawlessly run campaign. Queen Latifah never endorses anyone. She came out and endorsed. She had every prominent celebrity voice. She had the Taylor Swift, she had the Swifties, she had the Beehive. You could not have run a better campaign in that short period of time.
Now, despite my joyful demeanor, I am in truth never thrilled when anybody loses their job. It's a very tough thing to have happen to you. I've never met Joy Reid. For all I know, she's a perfectly nice person. But I think that if you really believe as she just said, Kamala Harris's campaign was flawlessly run, and your evidence of how great and successful it was is that even Queen Latifah came out in support of Kamala Harris. I think you're just very deeply out of touch with ordinary people. And that's not even getting into actually the main Joy Reid controversy from several years ago, is that she was accused of authoring these blog posts, if you recall, that were actually deeply homophobic, I think, was the accusation against them. And she said she was hacked and that she never wrote them, but she clearly did write them. That was just a made-up lie. Not that it was the biggest deal ever, but it was weird as a professional journalist to lie about having I think it's clear she lied about authoring the post. But anyway, we don't know that she will be off MSNBC. It's just the show has been canceled. I don't know if she's parting ways with the network. Can't tell. Her staff has been let go. They were very irate finding that out after this news had already leaked to the press. I can certainly understand them being upset. This news did kind of come out of nowhere. I don't think people were expecting an imminent cancellation of her program. So I certainly feel for her staff in that regard.
So let me push back on many of the things you said.
Go for it.
Now, first of all, you mentioned that you'd never met her. I have met her a couple of times, though not for several years. She has always been very pleasant and nice to me. So that is part of it. But also, I think there are about 3 at least different strands to this whole story. Joy Reid should not be immune to criticism, obviously, nor should I, nor should you, nor should anyone. So there are valid criticisms. Then in this case, there is the question of who is making the criticism in the general discourse and why they are making that criticism. I think what we've seen is this social media explosion over this, because she is a polarizing figure, over what is at its root a fairly straightforward ratings decision. When you look at the ratings, more often than not, her total audience is a bit smaller than the show that precedes her, which is Ari Melber's show on MSNBC. If that is the case consistently in any form of linear television, where a lot depends on how you're judged against your lead-in, you're going to be in difficulty one way or another, whether people like you or not. Then there's a separate question, and this is where I think people like myself find ourselves reflexively defensive of Joy Reid whenever we see her being criticised by Megyn Kelly or Marjorie Taylor Greene or President Trump, as happened just a few hours before we're having this conversation. Megyn Kelly described her as the absolute worst person on television. I mean, frankly, Megyn Kelly would be a lot higher up on my list of the worst people on television than Joy Reid would be. Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about, truth in journalism, most famously known for her Jewish space lasers theory. So I think whenever you get those people, then of course there's a natural inclination from people of even a moderately liberal disposition to defend Joy Reid. Now, the other thing is, some of the opposition to her, yes, the homophobic blog post thing was a bad moment for her. I don't think there's any question about that. And yes, there are certain comments, like anyone, including me, who is engaged in on-camera opinionating. There are things that you can object to or that we all put badly. My problem with some of the criticism of Joy Reid is that I think there has always been a strand of white conservatism in this country that hates to be reminded of racism and how frequently it crops up in American life and what a consistent thread it has been in American life. And I think that Joy Reid, as the first female black anchor of a cable news show, was targeted in that way, in a way that even Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes, who get a fair amount of criticism, are not.
Well, look, I hear you on that, but then I wonder if is she getting more criticism because she does not as good or thorough a job in getting her views out? That, like, Chris Hayes, I disagree with just as strongly. I think the arguments he makes are often more compelling or more substantive or more difficult to dismiss, even when I disagree with him. To some extent, there are often on Twitter I find it to be a little less thorough, whereas Joy Reid is just that's her. And I'm not suggesting that it is never wrong to say that racism is the motivating reason for X, Y, or Z, or that it's never correct, to say that. It seemed like she would turn to that well very frequently. She would draw on it.
Well, I just see a lot online in the 24 hours roughly since we got this news, where things are being framed by people on the right on X and elsewhere as racist, as in her being racist against white people, that I don't read that way at all. I mean, somebody cited that and then played a clip of her basically saying she would vote for any Democrat over Trump. I don't see what is problematic about that. I think that is the opinion of millions and millions of liberals in this country. There's also I guess, an infamous clip very much propagated by the right about her talking about white tears. And what she was actually talking about in the broader context was the Kyle Rittenhouse case and linking him to Brett Kavanaugh as white men who were, as she saw it, sort of performatively regretful about things they had done in the past. In Rittenhouse's case, the crimes of which he was accused and eventually acquitted, and that she felt, with, in my view, some justification, that there is greater leeway permitted to white men for those reactions than there typically is to black women.
What do you think about the replacement hosts who have been ushered in here? To me, that does not actually suggest that they're suddenly pivoting in a less progressive direction. Simone Sanders has very similar criticisms as Joy Reid. Simone Sanders I've criticized in the past for her whole "this is Biden's nomination, he's the president, bow down" kind of myopia about her, I think, on that. Yeah. Michael Steele is a textbook never Trump Republican person who's now indistinguishable from any progressive Democrat, but is ostensibly, this is the kind of diversity of thought that occurs in MSNBC circles. And Alicia Menendez, I barely know at all. But I saw a Axios report this morning that apparently the plan is to remain just as stridently progressive as ever.
Yeah, and I think that is almost certainly going to be the case. I do not detect any change of ideological positioning. I think, MSNBC and Fox both have decided that they're going to preach to the choir constantly. Your point briefly about Simone Sanders and Biden's nomination, one of the criticisms that I would have of her and sometimes of Joy Reid was, even while tonally being kind of leftist, they have tended to be very supportive of the Democratic Party leadership. Back in 2016, I think Joy, who I like personally, was too dismissive of the kind of Bernie Sanders people, but there we go.
I agree with that. Next up on Rising, even Joe Rogan thinks DOGE has maybe gone a little too far, but I don't. We'll discuss. Stay tuned. The Trump administration is going full throttle trying to enact their agenda and keep promises they made during the campaign trail.
Over the last weekend, we've noticed something new: pushback.
Some of it anyway. Let's start with Democratic Maine Governor Janet Mills. Her clash with Trump on Friday. Trump signed an executive order called Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports, which bans transgender women from competing in women's sports.
Maine officials, however, have said their duty is to provide equal opportunities to all kids in the state and that they won't comply. They cite the Maine Human Rights Act.
Here's a clip of Trump and Mills on Friday during a White House meeting with the governors.
Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
Well, we are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor, because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
Separate from those fireworks, we have an incident at a town hall in Roswell, Georgia, which is a reliably Republican district. Congressman Rich McCormick, who is himself a Republican, of course, was taking questions from constituents when this happened.
Yeah,
Tyranny.
Virginia, do you have a question for the congressman?
I do.
Okay.
I do. Thank you. Tyranny is rising in the White House, and a man has declared himself our king. So I would like to know, rather, the people would like to know what you, congressmen, and your fellow congressmen are going to do to rein in the megalomaniac in the White House.
The nation's most famous special government employee, Elon Musk, is also facing pushback, even from some allies. Even podcaster Joe Rogan hinted on his show recently that Musk should be at least a bit more cautious.
This is important too, because today, now they're talking about Social Security.
Yeah.
And that people are receiving Social Security that are 150 years old. But I don't think that is the reality as it's being explained by people who understand COBOL, the language, and this computer programming language that they use is ancient, right? Which is kind of crazy that they're still using that, right?
It's the government. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
So some guy who understands it was explaining that if certain factors aren't taken into consideration or certain things aren't entered in, like date of birth or when there's certain things,
or date of death, or,
right? But it doesn't even necessarily mean that all these people are receiving checks,
right? Right. They're just listed on the files,
right? And
it doesn't mean money's going out to them. And so, again, from a messaging perspective, does Elon need to screenshot that and then send it out as a tweet or whatever we call X nowadays, and then suddenly you've got a couple million people going, oh my God, we're paying dead people. Well,
right. That's the problem with being hyperbolic.
Musk took to X this weekend and wrote, consistent with President Trump's instructions, all federal employees will shortly receive an email requesting to understand what they got done last week. Failure to respond will be taken as a resignation. The email itself reads, please reply to this email with approximately 5 bullet points of what you accomplished this week and CC your manager.
But Trump's FBI director, Kash Patel, wrote an email to employees, and it says in part, FBI personnel may have received an email from OPM requesting information. Patel said that it was the FBI who was in charge of their own review processes, and they will stick to that plan. The email continues, for now, please pause any responses. Meanwhile, some Democratic senators, women particularly prominent among them, responded to Musk's request on X. Minnesota Senator Tina Smith wrote, Elon Musk, I hate to break it to you, but you aren't my boss. I answer to the people of Minnesota, but since you bring it up, I spent last week fighting to stop tax breaks for billionaires like you, paid for by defunding healthcare for moms and babies. In another tweet, she wrote, this is the ultimate dick boss move from Musk, except he isn't even the boss, he's just a dick. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski chimed in, writing in part, if Elon Musk truly wants to understand what federal workers accomplished over the past week, he should get to know each department and agency and learn about the jobs he's trying to cut. And Senator Amy Klobuchar wrote, 5 things I did last week, Musk. 1. Successfully asked you to rehire 300 nuclear and avian flu workers you accidentally fired. 2. Pressed you to pay attention to rising household costs. 3. Stood up for vets. 4. Fought against your tax cuts for the rich. 5. Stood with Ukraine instead of Russia.
Conservative communications official Matt Whitlock responded, so basically you just tweeted a bunch of stuff. Conservative filmmaker and commentator Mike Cernovich wrote, federal employees and contractors are the most spoiled adults in the world, gold-plated benefits packages, paid sick leave, 6-figure pensions, and they don't even work. 5 bullet points is too much for them to even come up with. Editor-in-chief of The Federalist, Molly Hemingway, wrote the following, it is hilarious to me that the thing that people in the private sector deal with daily is unfathomable to federal employees. They are freaking out about this, but why not just say quickly what you accomplished the previous week? An opportunity to share your importance, etc. Much to grapple with here. Maybe
enormous amounts.
We can just start at the end. What is so wrong, Niall, with being asked to supply a number of items that you got done this week? I don't see that as so outrageous to me.
There is nothing in principle wrong with saying, what did you get done this week, assuming that the question is asked in good faith and it is not accompanied by a threat. In Elon Musk's message, it was very much accompanied by a threat, which was the idea that a failure to respond would lead to the termination of people from their jobs. There is no obvious authority that he has to make that claim. I see representatives of the main union representing government employees contend that anything like that would face immediate legal challenge because the authority just simply doesn't exist. I think the problem with it is him giving people an ultimatum whenever it is widely assumed that he's just trying to boot them out of jobs.
I mean, isn't that a problem that the authority doesn't exist to fire? I mean, this is why people complain about the government or the public sector being inefficient compared to the private sector. There's no Trump, in his capacity as the head of the federal government, has no ability to fire people who wouldn't respond to an email saying that this is what I actually do. That seems like a problem, no?
Well, I mean, they are covered by union contracts for the most part, and that is how it is. I also want to push back a little bit because it links to the Joe Rogan comment that we started off with about the idea about Social Security being improper payments going out and so forth, because the actual level of inefficiency in that respect is vastly smaller than Trump and Musk have tried to suggest. And to be fair to Joe Rogan, who I think we both agree is increasingly trending rightward, he did actually point that out. Now, it goes a bit more in depth than Rogan's comments outlined, because in July 2024 there was an audit done, and it did indeed find that there were almost 19 million people born before 1920 that there was no record of their death in the Social Security records. However, in just 44,000 cases out of 18.9 million were there any payments still being made. Now, admittedly, there probably aren't 44,000 people over the age of 115, but nonetheless, but nonetheless, it is obviously being vastly overstated by Musk and Trump the extent to which this is a real problem.
Yeah, it's been overstated. You know, it's still an issue, and I think the best and affirmative case for DOGE is to doing the overhaul of the technical side of the way government's websites and payment systems work, and trying to upgrade that to be competitive and efficient in a more modern era. I hope they continue to look at those kinds of things. Let's get to a little bit of the other subjects we covered there. I don't think, correct me if you disagree, is the sticking point, is the place where Democratic governors or senators are on best footing to oppose what Donald Trump is doing on the transgender sports order? I don't think I would choose to make my stand on that. Now, it may be the case that Maine has some state law that prohibits them from implementing this federal executive order, and then there will have to be a court case. This, ends up being a messy subject. I often don't like when the federal government compels states to do things. I think states should largely be, I'm more on the side of letting states experiment with different policies, and we'll see who works best. But of course, Democrats and Republicans both do this when they capture the federal government, is try to, force their way on states and withhold funding. So there's nothing new there. However, Trump is probably right that this is one of the most unpopular things Democrats could oppose him on.
So this is one of these issues where the divides between you and I take on a kind of complicated shape, because I take the point that making a stand on the importance of state law on this topic is an issue that I have some problems with, because Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, is essentially arguing, I think, that the Maine civil rights law supersedes the federal law.
Which is obviously not correct.
Which is not correct. And in fact, obviously if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, right, debates over school integration, right, it was people on the liberal side who said, well, obviously the federal law supersedes and states just can't go their own way. So I do think that's a pretty shaky argument, in coupling with the fact that on the trans people in sports issue, popular opinion is pretty clearly on Trump's side. I think the stronger part of her argument is about the threat to withdraw federal funding. She argues that the president cannot deny funding that Congress has appropriated, I think is the argument.
Although that is a common occurrence. I remember criticizing the Obama and Biden administrations numerous times for their education departments threatening to withhold funds to colleges for not implementing a variety of interpretations of Title IX that I thought were just utterly ludicrous, but that's what they were saying. I guess we'll leave it there. It was funny reading that comment from, I think it was from Tina Smith, calling Elon Musk a dick, and I was thinking, you're lucky you're not in Germany. They'll haul you to jail for that remark.
Well, I don't know about that, Robby.
They will. That's what they said in those that CBS 60 Minutes segment. They said you call somebody a dick, straight to jail, or straight to ticket.
Maybe there's a defense for being accurate in Elon Musk's case.
I don't think so. All right, we will continue to discuss and debate. Next up, a Jewish gay atheist argues in his new book, for more Christianity to help redeem democracy. We'll interview the author of that book. Stay tuned. A provocative new book that's out posits that Christian evangelicals have lost their way when it comes to politics. Jonathan Rauch, a self-proclaimed Jewish, gay, atheist writer, writes that a church of fear has arisen. His new book, is called Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy.
Rauch goes on to write that militant Christian nationalists have moved away from the teachings of Jesus, and instead they embrace the notion of, quote, winning in politics and winning in the culture wars.
Here to offer his somewhat existential argument and expand on why he believes today's version of Christianity is very much a church of fear is Jonathan Rauch. Welcome to Rising.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so great to have you. Congrats on the new book. Why don't you, give us the 30 or 40-second pitch for what it is about and why you think Christianity has gone astray in terms of its political advocacy.
The one-sentence summary is that America is becoming ungovernable in significant part because Christianity is a load-bearing wall in our democracy, and it's failing. But the solution is not less Christianity, it's more Christianity. It's returning to the teachings of Jesus, which turn out to be a lot of what our country needs to do politics better and heal right now.
So what are some tangible examples you have of the way that you think Christianity, and I assume how it is used throughout the Republican Party, is harming our country, harming our democracy?
Well, I should say that I'm not a Christian myself. I don't pretend to be. I rely on the work and thinking of a lot of people who are Christians who are terribly concerned about what's happened. So a lot of people don't know this, Robby, but you remember that famous quote that Donald Trump said about, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his supporters were so loyal that they'd keep supporting him?
I quite remember.
He said that at Dordt University, which is an evangelical college in Iowa. And it's the same speech where he says, if you elect me, you will have power. Remember that. A constant theme of his. And that's been the trade-off that white evangelicals have made. They get power, and in exchange, he gets their unconditional loyalty. So the problem with that is right in Matthew 4:10, Satan takes Jesus up to the mountaintop, shows him the whole of the world, says, you can have all of this if you'll bow down and worship me. And of course, Jesus turns that down. Christianity does not do what it needs to do for our country's spiritual health and its emotional health, and for that matter, really its mental health, if it's chasing power instead of teaching the gospel.
Jonathan, to, I suppose, declare an interest of a kind. I am not a religious person. I'm not a believer in any organized religion. I guess I have some somewhat woo-woo spiritual beliefs, but not a believer in Christianity or any other major religion. And so when you talk about the solution being not less Christianity but more Christianity, I have an automatic sort of secularist flinch away from that, because I don't really understand what the argument for more Christianity is. If it is that Christianity has a moral code, well, okay, but I mean, different Christians interpret that moral code in vastly different ways. And, you know, going back to the debates that emerged when Christopher Hitchens wrote God is Not Great, there's real debate about whether morality emanates from religion or exists separate from it. I certainly don't think atheists like you or I are morally inferior in any way. So given all of that, what exactly is the argument for more Christianity?
Well, thank you. To answer that question, we have to look at the specific teachings of Jesus Christ, which is what I, as an outsider, try to do in this book. Christians say if you had to define the teachings of Jesus, standing as it were on one foot, it would be three things. The first is don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible. The second is imitate Jesus, strive to be like him. And the third is forgive each other. Those are the core teachings. Some people add repentance, but those are the big three. Those translate very well from a secular point of view into core doctrines that the founders relied on to make the country work. Be not afraid is sometimes you lose an election. It's not the end of the world. You'll come back. You can learn from that. Don't lie about it. Don't try to steal the election. Have some confidence in this system. Be like Jesus says. Make sure and protect your minorities and minority rights, and never use people as means to an end. They're always ends in themselves. So treat fellow citizens with dignity and care even when you disagree. And third, forgive each other. That translates into sometimes you win an election, you're not out to crush the other side and rid the country of them and salt the soil with the tears of their women. You're going to share the country. You're going to remember and respect that they're your fellow citizens, and you're going to treat them the way you want to be treated when they're in power. The founder said those are core Republican virtues, and you have to have those or the Constitution will not work, and they were right. And those are the values that are intrinsic in the core teachings of Christianity.
And there's, so I agree with a lot of what you just said. I mean, I similarly am not a particularly religious person, although I was raised in a Catholic educational environment and have some affection for Catholic tradition. Where I think I disagree with you is on your earlier statement about power. Obviously, the pursuit of just, raw power for power's sake, I think one could easily make an argument is not a particularly positive religious goal or even just a good goal in general. Is kind of a supervillain ethos. But religious people, I think on the right would say, well, we've sought power through Trump, yes, this political alliance with Trump, in order to get tangible political goals that pertain to our religion, like restrictions on abortion or like more ironclad separation of gender-based policy in the legal system, things that conservative religious people have wanted for a long time are getting through Trump. Is that was it wrong for them to seek power in order to succeed in that project?
Well, a couple of things about that. The first is that the actual teaching of the gospel is pretty clear on this. Jesus says explicitly, separate the things of God from the things of power and focus on the next world. That's the Christian's role in life. So the religion itself has important doctrines on this, and one mustn't lose sight of that. But second, fundamentally, Robby, of course people of faith should participate in politics, and of course they should bring their whole selves to politics. No one's disputing that. It's a question of the how of politics, not the what, as the pastor Curtis Chang has put it. Do you address your fellow citizens in the spirit of those three principles that we just talked about, without fear and with civility, and in a spirit of toleration and forgiveness? Or, for example, do you address entire groups of people as vermin? Just for one example. It's the style of the address, the style of the participation in politics that's doing so much damage right now.
But just briefly, Jonathan, because we're almost out of time, I mean, I guess where I would push back a little is, I mean, those virtues that you talk about, those aren't exclusive to Christianity, for a start. Things like civility and treating people with forgiveness or with compassion. But also, I mean, to use a now deceased example, Jerry Falwell's vision of Christianity would be very different from the one that you have just put forth. So,
indeed, it would.
I mean, that seems to cut against the argument to some extent, no?
Well, of course, many people claim to be Christians, and but I think it's fair to say that the principles that we've been talking about are deeply embedded in the actual teachings of the gospel. The main takeaway of my book, Niall, is I'm not saying for a minute that you have to be Christian to be a good citizen or a moral person or to support the country. I'm not a Christian. I'm an outsider on three dimensions. But it is important that our country's founding faith, that's white Protestantism, be aligned enough with the core values of our Constitution so that they're not at war with each other. And the Church of Fear is pulling directly against those principles of liberal democracy that our Constitution relies on. And so all I'm pleading with is I'm not asking Christians to be more secular or democratic or Republican or liberal or conservative. I'm just saying if Christians were a bit more Christian, if they were following the teachings of their own gospel, it could do a lot to heal our politics, and actually it might also help heal the church.
Jonathan Rauch, thank you so much for joining us to discuss your new book. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next up, President Trump taps a surprising person to help lead the nation's law enforcement agency, the FBI. Find out more next.
You no longer have to be a senior FBI agent with extensive experience to help lead the nation's law enforcement agency. Breaking with tradition again, Trump has made it crystal clear that he prefers loyalty over experience. And podcaster Dan Bongino is his choice for Deputy Director of the FBI.
Bongino is a former New York City police officer and Secret Service agent before he became a conservative podcaster. The announcement was made by Trump on Truth Social on Sunday. Great news for law enforcement and American justice. Dan Bongino, a man of incredible love and passion for our country, has just been named the next Deputy Director of the FBI by the man who will be the best ever director, Kash Patel. Dan has a master's degree in psychology from CUNY and an MBA from Penn State.
In the Friday episode of the Dan Bongino Show, titled The Golden Age of Republican Politics, there was a segment on Kash Patel. Let's listen.
Thank you for getting Kash Patel through. Kash Patel is there for one reason. He is there to make the FBI great again. Folks, if we do not have a credible deterrent to spies in this country, counterintelligence, to terrorists that are planning plots here openly, some coordination entity for both transnational and interstate crime, we're not going to have a country. Kash is committed to that and that only.
Reactions are pouring in on social media from all sides. Charlie Kirk wrote on X, "Wow, breaking, great patriot, dear friend Dan Bongino has just been named Deputy Director of the FBI. This is incredible news. Thank you, Dan Bongino, for the sacrifice. I know this is in service to our country. America just got a huge upgrade."
Journalist Mehdi Hassan, a big favourite of Robby's, wrote on Blue Sky, "Imagine if Joe Biden had made one of the Krasenstein brothers Deputy Director of the FBI. That would have been a way less controversial or outrageous move than making Dan Bongino, a man too extreme for Fox, Deputy Director of the FBI."
Benny Johnson wrote on X, "Throwback, Dan Bongino on possibly being put in charge of a special task force to reform the Secret Service. The boss calls and asks you to serve your country. You do it." He has now been named Deputy Director of the FBI. Congratulations, Dan Bongino.
NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian wrote on X, "Traditionally, the Deputy FBI Director has been a career FBI agent. That is particularly important when the Director has no experience at the FBI. Donald Trump today announced he is appointing as Deputy Director Dan Bongino, a former Secret Service agent and prolific conspiracy theorist. He has never spent a day working at the FBI, but he has spent many hours spouting baseless falsehoods about the Bureau, such as that the FBI lied when they said they don't have a suspect in the pipe bombs outside the RNC and DNC on January 15th, 2021. Current and former FBI officials are appalled and extremely concerned for the national security of the country."
Dan Bongino, I suspect, is not one of your favorite people.
Don't tune in to the Dan Bongino Show on a regular basis, I must say.
I do not. I occasionally see his clips across my social feed, and this is going to be a case where I recognize that he is an extremely controversial figure from a mainstream perspective, and for all I know, he believes and says things that I don't agree with or think are too extreme. I have not seen very many of those clips, and usually when I see him talking, he's saying something I agree with, but I'm not putting out there that that's the extent of what he has to say. But why does this person particularly irk people of a more liberal persuasion?
For two reasons, I think, primarily. One is he doesn't have any experience that seems tantamount or appropriate to holding that job. And so I think people basically see this as Trump's propensity to sort of govern by trolling or to put trolls in absolutely very sensitive positions. Kash Patel is similarly in that category, writing books where he sort of has an enemies list at the end of them and indulges in all sorts of conspiracy theories.
Well, but isn't that a different argument against Kash? I mean, Kash Patel is, I think, qualified, sir, for the job. He has a background in law enforcement and actually worked as a defense attorney for a number of years, which I think is a worthy skill.
I think it's a very worthy skill. I'm not sure that it qualifies you to be director of the FBI, which is not traditionally where that role has been drawn from. I don't think that his background, such as it is in those areas, is a qualification for that particular task. But more to the point, in Kash Patel and Dan Bongino's case, the problem is not whether their resume qualifies them, it's whether their resume disqualifies them, in the sense of both propagating false claims about the 2020 election being stolen, both making incendiary claims as a matter of course, both expressing sort of glee, the famous Dan Bongino quote about 2018, "My entire life right now is about owning the libs." Do we want, whether you want to own the libs or not, do we think that that is really an appropriate person to be running the main law enforcement agency in the country?
Yeah. I mean, it's reflective of Trump's preference for picking very bombastic, conservative personalities from TV and radio.
And kind of henchmen, though, Robby, no?
Yeah, I mean, this is the Trump plan, the criticism of the FBI and other government agencies is that they are not reflective of or implementing the will of the elected president. That's what Kash Patel is ostensibly empowered to do.
This is where we get, I think, in the sort of philosophical disagreement. It's not their job to implement the will of the president. It's their job to implement the law. That's the issue. And so whenever you talk about implementing the will of the president, whenever the current president's will has included going after people who he believes have wronged him, the whole point of having an independent law enforcement apparatus is that you don't just, it's not just weaponized for a president's personal vendettas.
Well, I agree with that, and it should not be weaponized for the president's personal vendettas. But again, the conservative critique of the FBI is that they would say it was weaponized previously to go after, political opponents of the system. And I think you can point to the FBI doing just that in terms of the FISA surveillance of Carter Page, a surveillance that I have written about and discussed on Rising as, in my view, having been totally inappropriate, and the subsequent review of that having found that the warrant was granted over and over again with very little validity to it, or very little reason to suspect he was a legitimate subject of this inquiry. That was something that Kash Patel, in his role as working with Devin Nunes, I believe, in the House Intelligence Committee, had a role in exposing that kind of, what conservatives would say was deep state malfeasance against a political opponent or a political person within the Trump orbit. So if it's about fixing the weaponization, not redirecting the weaponization to be against the enemies of Trump, I don't want to do that, but fixing the weaponization. Sometimes I think liberals or Democrats talk about these institutions as if they were totally neutral and they're just acting in good faith, and Trump is trying to make them political. But what many conservatives believe, sometimes I think wrongly, but sometimes, like in the case I just outlined, correctly, that this neutral system is actually targeting them.
But firstly, I fundamentally disagree with that. The Carter Page thing was a admittedly controversial element within a broader picture where even the people who looked into that believed that the overall investigation into Trump had legitimate justification. Yes, it ended up in the Mueller report, which was we'd get into the Mueller report again. It was inconclusive, I would say. But the point about it is that the overall investigation, Crossfire Hurricane, was launched on legitimate grounds, broadly speaking. Now, in terms of the weaponization of the Justice Department, I just don't at all accept the argument that that there was anything during the Biden administration that was as you have characterized it. And I think that the charges ultimately laid against Trump were justifiable charges in all 4 of the criminal cases in which he was indicted.
Well, let us know what you think. Next up, Zelensky won't cave to POTUS's demands. What's his latest idea? We'll talk about it. Stay tuned. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has the news cycle buzzing with his latest proposals for peace.
During a news conference in Kyiv, Zelensky said, "If peace for Ukraine requires me to step down, I'm ready. Another scenario, I could trade my position for NATO membership if that's what it takes." Zelensky also responded to the Trump administration's request for a mineral rights deal.
In response to the billions in aid the U.S. has sent to Ukraine, Trump proposed that the Eastern European country should grant us rights to billions in rare earth minerals as back pay.
Zelensky, however, isn't having it. He told reporters recently, "I do not recognize that Kyiv owes the US even $100 billion. We agree with Biden that this was a grant. A grant is not a debt." European leaders will be holding an emergency summit on March 6th to discuss the war and what's next for Ukraine.
Trump and Zelensky had traded some shots last week. The commander-in-chief called Zelensky a dictator, in part for not holding elections.
Zelensky responded by saying Trump was living in a Russian disinformation space.
The Trump team also held peace talks with Russia last week. They did not include Ukraine in those talks.
Now, Zelensky is adamant that he won't accept a deal between Russia and the US if his country doesn't have a seat at the table. Senator Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, wrote on X, "United States support for Ukraine was never about securing mineral rights or providing security for money. It was about democracy and sovereignty and a willingness to defend our allies and oppose our enemies."
Senior writer at National Review, Dan McLaughlin, wrote on X, as the saying goes, if you owe the bank $10,000, the bank owns you. If you own the bank $10 million, you own the bank. Nobody knows this better than Trump. Ukraine now owes us something we will not lightly abandon. It's worth noting that today does mark the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the beginnings of that war.
Today, we should also note, Robby, that today also marks a visit from French President Emmanuel Macron, who will be discussing these things with Mr. Trump. Anyway,
yes,
go ahead.
Indeed. Well, look, I think it's unfortunately the case that the aid given to Ukraine by President Biden was strings not attached, and it was not premised on the situation where Ukraine would somehow repay us. I think that's deeply regrettable, and it would have been way better if it was structured as a loan such that we could get something economically beneficial out of it. That, in fact, might have helped sell the project better to the American people who wonder why we always must sacrifice to send billions overseas in a doomed military effort that is not going to successfully repel Russia.
Hold on a second. I mean, I know you are, generally speaking, anti-interventionist, and in many instances I share that view. But the logical extension of that argument would be if a aggressor country invaded a country that had little money and little else of value, we should just say, well, tough, you can't pay for our help, so that's just bad luck for you.
I mean, yeah, why are we obligated? Why do we got to do something every time this happens? I mean, that would commit us to defending, are we going to be the world's policeman? We're not even, on paper, we don't have to defend Ukraine because they're not a member of NATO, which is part of what kicked off this whole thing. Now, I would like to get to a place where we can easily resolve this, where I don't think Ukraine is getting NATO membership. That's something Trump has basically taken off the table. And Russia does not want to be bordering a NATO country. We can have a guarantee of security and safety for the rest of Ukraine from Europe or even from the U.S. in exchange for the end of the war. I think it's interesting that Zelensky has offered to step down. I mean, he shouldn't have to step down. He just has to face re-election like the leader of a democratically elected country, like anyone else. I understand that they can put elections on hold, and you sometimes do this. This is kind of alien to us in the U.S., where we don't put elections on hold for any reason, but fine.
Well, you haven't been invaded in recent past.
I mean, the Civil War was a pretty bloody conflict. And
Civil War was fought between Americans, as the name suggests.
Well, right, but I mean, the southern part would say they were facing an invasion.
Well, look, the bigger part here is that Trump is telling these lies in terms of Ukraine was responsible for starting the war and Zelensky is a dictator as a way to change the moral lens through which this thing is viewed. If you adopt his fictional account of it, you then alleviate from the United States any moral obligation to help, which is what it's really about. Zelensky isn't a dictator. He was elected in 2019 with 75% of the vote in a runoff. The Ukrainian constitution allows for the suspension of elections when they're under martial law, which naturally they are because the Russians are occupying a fifth of their country. So this is just a way to try to weasel out of a sense of moral obligation.
I think it's certainly wrong, and I criticized Trump last week for saying this, that that Ukraine or Zelensky is at fault for the start of the war. I don't agree with that. I don't see why you would have to characterize it that way. I think characterizing Zelensky as a dictator, I'm not sure I would call him a dictator, but I mean, that's an opinion one can form based on not just that he has not faced re-election yet, but that he's suspended rival political parties and independent media for a variety of reasons. Look, I would say that Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War was also dictatorial. That's like my editorial view. That's not wrong to call him a dictator on that basis,
you think
right?
that Abraham Lincoln was a dictator?
Yes, I think suspending civil liberties for any reason is dictatorial and should not be done even in the midst of war.
Well, there's a difference, but was he a dictator? Abraham Lincoln was a dictator.
In that respect, yes.
See, then it gets into a kind of funging it slightly. Is it in that respect? I mean,
I'm perfectly willing to call just about every president other than Calvin Coolidge a dictator. So.
Sorry, you've temporarily thrown me by that remark. What?
They're all dictators. They're all violating American civil liberties routinely on a variety of fronts all the time.
So that makes them a dictator?
Yeah, that's what.
So you would describe everyone, I mean, George H.W. Bush, Obama are all dictators.
Doesn't the left call George W. Bush a dictator? Isn't that a common talking point to say that he's a dictator?
I would not call him a dictator. I mean, people who are democratically elected are not dictators.
Is Trump a dictator?
No, I don't think Trump's a dictator. I think Trump has authoritarian tendencies, but I don't think he's a dictator.
So you would say he's an authoritarian, but not a dictator?
Yeah.
Okay. I think of those as synonyms, so maybe we're just having a very academic distinction then.
Even by your idiosyncratic libertarian standards, it seems quite a stretch to describe every president of the United States as a dictator.
Right. If you prefer the word authoritarian rather than dictator, I will say that instead.
But you think that is true of every president?
I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but I think they have virtually every president has, again, with the exception of like Calvin Coolidge or a handful of others, has manifested authoritarian tendencies in a variety of ways.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure we've very far much we can go with that.
Right.
Robby Suave, every American president's a dictator. There we go.
Coming up on Rising, Vivek Ramaswamy is set to make a major announcement. We'll tell you what that is. Well, it may have been a while since you heard the name Vivek Ramaswamy in the news cycle.
Turns out the biotech entrepreneur and former presidential candidate has filed paperwork to run for governor of Ohio.
Ramaswamy had tweeted yesterday that he had a big announcement to make. He also wrote on X, "Get cell phones out of the classroom, start physical education in kindergarten, bring back the presidential fitness test. The best way to save on healthcare costs in the long run is to foster a healthier population in the first place. It's going to be up to the states to step up and get it done."
Here's Ramaswamy on the PBD podcast in October discussing a potential run.
If you asked me 6 months ago, I would have said no. I mean, it wasn't even in my headspace. But I will tell you, as I live in Ohio, I was born and raised there, this is the number one thing that people across the state will come literally plead with me, beg me to do. And so when people are in your own state begging you to do something that it's not something that I view as a pleasurable job. It's not something that I have always aspired to in my whole life. But public service is about serving the public, right?
Ramaswamy was initially set to co-lead DOGE with Elon Musk, but he did leave that project in January. He told the Breakfast Club host, Charlemagne the God, that elected office was the better path for him at the moment. Ramaswamy also said there were conflicting visions for the project between him and Musk, but that they still get along.
The Ohio governor's race includes the state's Attorney General, Dave Yost, entrepreneur Heather Hill, and former state health director, Dr. Amy Acton. Well, here's Vivek going for it. I mean, he has a good chance. I have I've some skepticism about Vivek Ramaswamy for various reasons, including, I think, the business record that he extols as one of his premier qualifications is a bit more dubious than he tries to make it appear. There was the whole episode, which we won't relitigate in full here, where he basically seemed to talk up the prospect of a certain drug cashed out, and then that drug notably failed to live up to its promise, and there were all sorts of questions around that. He then, I think, sort of tethered himself to Trump very closely, having had not got very far with his own presidential bid. I tend to see him as a bit of an opportunist, but that doesn't mean that an opportunist can't win elections if it's the right opportunity.
Yes, indeed. His split from DOGE is not fully understood why that took place. It was just a personality clash or differences of approach. What I have heard reading between the lines is it seems possible to me that Vivek was more set on finding real cuts to make in terms of exposing Medicare fraud, which there's a tremendous amount of that, but that includes taking on very powerful interest groups like the insurance companies, et cetera. You cannot balance the budget. You cannot bring government spending under control unless you're willing to do something about defense and entitlements. There have been rumors, by the way, that DOGE is going to look at defense. Pete Hegseth, I think, put out a memo suggesting that was coming. I still hope that is going to be the case. That's an area where you and I agree on. But anyway, that the Vivek approach was not the one they wanted to go with. So but he's a talented speaker, and I think really did successfully endear himself to many MAGA people on the campaign trail, ostensibly running against Trump while really being Trump's surrogate in the debates when Trump did not participate. So I think he could have a bright future in elected office, and he should go for it.
I do think he could win, obviously, not least because Ohio itself has trended a lot more Republican over the years. When I first came to the US about 20 years ago, first election I covered was 2004. Ohio then was considered the key swing state. It continued to be a key swing state for a couple of subsequent elections, but after the Obama era has become much, much more Republican. So whoever becomes the Republican nominee, it would be the favorite to win the governor's mansion, I suppose. And Ramaswamy, because of his closeness to Trump, because of his loyalty to Trump, would obviously be well set to do that.
There was some indication that he wanted the J.D. Vance's Senate seat to be picked as the replacement for that. That did not happen. It's not happening. So he could run for governor, however, and we'll see. I've always appreciated that he makes himself available to a lot of podcasters, a lot of internet shows. He was on Rising, I think, twice back in the day before he was running for president, or maybe while he was running for president. He was on, as we played that clip of him, with Patrick Bet-David, who does a lot of interviews with high-profile people all over the political spectrum.
I saw him just in the courtyard of our building here a few weeks ago. We should have dragged him in for an impromptu...
Just outside?
Yeah, just outside. So we should have dragged him in for a Rising interview again for that. Do you think that the split with Musk, you would have a better insight, obviously, into the conservative movement than I would. Does the split with Musk, I mean, I guess it wasn't that acrimonious at all, but that doesn't hamper him at all with sort of MAGA world people, in your judgment?
No, I don't think so, because as you said, it was not acrimonious. They're not like feuding in public. Obviously, if Trump turned on Vivek, that would be the end of him, but there's no inclination that is going to happen. And I think, being a little cynical, I think some in the mainstream media were looking for any evidence that there's some kind of rift in Trump world. They're really keen to start finding some rift between Elon and Trump that could materialize eventually. I know that's very possible. Certainly has not materialized yet. And I think they were trying to find a way to say, oh, look, it's the coalition's already cracking apart, breaking up, when that doesn't really seem to fit the facts between them.
I actually think that split, or the idea of a split, has become somewhat more salient just within the past few days, because there has been some blowback, including from Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, against that tweet that Musk sent, and then the subsequent email about people doing bullet points in order to protect their jobs. There seems to have been some perception that Musk was getting over his skis there, but that, I agree, is a separate thing for the Ramaswamy-Musk dispute or difference.
Next up, my colleague at Reason Magazine, Christian Britschgi, will join us to talk about the lawsuits DOGE is facing. Stay tuned. Federal workers have received a stream of emails from DOGE and Elon Musk over the last months on a range of issues. Over the past several weeks, nearly a dozen lawsuits have been filed challenging DOGE's access to federal government record systems, mostly on claims that this access violates various procedural requirements found in federal privacy regulations. Journalist Christian Britschgi of Reason Magazine delved into these lawsuits. In his article, he writes, quote, "In a nod to the online nature of the case, their original complaint cites an anonymous, since-deleted Reddit post about the process by which the email system was set up. More recent court filings also lean on a podcast interview in which a privacy expert evaluates the potential for data breaches as a result of the new email system." Here with us now to go deeper into these lawsuits is my colleague, Christian Britschgi. Welcome to Rising.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So go over these lawsuits with us. I mean, I think it probably strikes many people as odd that can President Trump or the head of the federal government email all the federal employees? What sort of legal issues are at play? Is government never going to be efficient if you can't have some level of communication taking place there?
Sure. So on the issue of this email server that was set up at the Office of Personnel Management, basically the White House HR department for the entire federal government, the legal issue at play is whether there was an email server set up by DOGE staffers to email all federal employees. This was the email server that they've used to offer their fork in the road deferred resignation program, where federal employees could resign and receive 8 months pay. And then it's also this email system that they're using now to send out these emails saying, what did you do this week? So the legal issue that was first raised in a lawsuit filed by unnamed government employees back in early January was whether the server was set up without producing a privacy impact assessment, which is something required when you are creating basically a new government database that includes personally identifiable information. You have to produce one of these statements or assessments and then publish a notification of it in the Federal Register. Federal employees sued, saying that this process was not followed. Therefore, this email server was set up illegally, and therefore the government isn't allowed to use it. There's been, as you mentioned, there's been, we're getting, past the dozen point of lawsuits filed challenging DOGE's various access to different record systems, payment systems. All of them make varying claims, some of them about this privacy impact assessment, others citing other aspects of federal privacy regulations and procedural requirements attached to it. But that is most relevant for whether DOGE and the president can email employees all at once.
And do you think there's a substantive issue there? I mean, setting aside who will ultimately prevail in this case, is it problematic if the government or the president or the executive branch or Elon Musk have used this measure, this server, without going through those procedures that were previously outlined?
I would say no. It doesn't strike me as particularly egregious that this is an ability that the president would have. And again, I would also point to the fact that, so in that lawsuit, a district court judge rejected the plaintiff's request for temporary restraining order, basically on the grounds that while they might eventually prevail in the merits, that the injury to these government employees, they hadn't really shown that there was going to be some sort of imminent irreparable harm. He said, at worst, the information that might be disclosed is their work emails, which he was rather dismissive of as a reason to grant a temporary restraining order. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean he might not rule a different way once all the merits have been decided. But so I think the injury there is not extreme. And this is data the government already would have access to via other means. This was an attempted streamlining within the executive branch. I don't consider it a huge power grab or something like that.
Let's get a little bit more big picture. You and I have discussed what DOGE is doing, privately a number of times. You wrote something, I think, over the weekend describing the sunny side of Donald Trump's power grabs. You and I think, are both concerned about some of what's going on. Maybe our concern is that, DOGE is not even doing enough to really grapple with, reckless government spending, bloat, that kind of thing. But, should people, like you and I, or people who agree with us on making government smaller and more efficient, be excited about the changes we're seeing, or are these, serious power grabs by a rogue president or a rogue non-governmental, special governmental actor, Elon Musk?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I like to think about this from, obviously a libertarian perspective is, Trump is not a libertarian. He's not doing this to really shrink the government. He's doing it to exert greater centralized control over the executive branch. Nevertheless, I think libertarians will probably end up being the primary beneficiaries of this effort. He wants to magnify the executive branch, but it doesn't seem like he's building, he's replacing what he views as a, liberal-dominated deep state with a government dominated by his own lackeys. I don't think he's going to be successful in that effort. I think the various kind of DOGE missteps or examples of what seem like kind of incompetence or just ill thought out moves testifies to that, speaks to that. But what will be left in its place is just less functional government bureaucracies that we don't think should exist at all. That doesn't apply necessarily to every, DOGE action. That certainly doesn't apply to all of President Trump's various executive orders when it comes to things like immigration, where obviously libertarians will be very critical of any sort of expansion of state power or executive power to deport people. But by and large, Trump is thrashing around, and what he's smashing is government bureaucracies that we don't think should exist in the first place. And so I'm sanguine about that. We'll see where it goes, but I'm not too freaked out, and maybe this will actually work out to libertarian benefit.
But if I'm understanding correctly, Christian, your sanguine outlook is based on the fact that the Trump effort to execute that plan is kind of dogged by incompetence, right? I mean, the impulse is there that you would find worrisome. You just think that they'll kind of trip over themselves in the attempt to do it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that, it's kind of a truism that it's easier to break something than to build something. And so if you shutter USAID, and then, a judge tells you have to bring back the staffers, you have to spin up these programs again, or maybe that's found to be perfectly legal and a subsequent administration tries to build it back up, they're going to have a much harder time doing that. And so as a result, if I don't think this agency should exist, then I'm happy to see its functions hobbled. Again, as I said in the piece that Robby referenced, this isn't the ideal way I would like to see someone go about it. It would be great if this were more methodical and this were done with the intent of shrinking government, getting it back into its more proper role. That's not on the table. That's not what's happening here. But when I look at the results and the likely results, it does seem to be a smaller, less capable federal government, and I'm all in favor of that.
Yeah, you and I have spent so much time arguing with the kind of new right people who are like, we need conservatives, Republicans to seize control of we need to run these institutions and replace the people who runs them with, with our people, kind of textbook, we must, use the ring to fight Sauron instead of destroying it. It looks like they're actually, intentionally or not, they're going with destroying it. So how upset can we really be? We got to leave it there. Christian Britschgi, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Up next, Jane Fonda is going after the right. Surprise, surprise. We'll discuss. Stay tuned.
In the 1970s, Jane Fonda went after the establishment, garnering the nickname Hanoi Jane. 50 years later, when accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award at Sunday's Screen Actors Guild Awards, she went after today's establishment. Let's watch.
Us, the workers, we actors, we don't manufacture anything tangible. What we create is empathy. Our job is to understand another human being. Make no mistake, empathy is not weak or woke. And by the way, woke just means you give a damn about other people.
Broadcaster Piers Morgan blasted Jane Fonda's comments on X, writing, "I bow to nobody in my admiration of Jane Fonda, but this is not what woke means. It actually means shaming, abusing, threatening, and canceling anyone who disagrees with you and sucking all the joy out of life. That is why everyone is sick of it."
Highly debatable from Mr. Morgan. Anyway, New York Times columnist Kyle Buchanan wrote on Blue Sky, "Every award show should have Jane Fonda."
Commentary Magazine executive editor Abe Greenwald wrote, Jane Fonda was quite supportive of Russian aggression in Vietnam. Why isn't she crowing about Trump's Ukraine policy? I am very confused. That last point there does speak to the kind of reversal on Russia hysteria that has taken place, where it used to be broadly speaking, Republicans who were like, the Russian communists
they're coming.
My precious bodily fluids, and now it's your mainstream or progressive Rachel Maddow type commenters that are always talking about Russia in every corner.
Well, I take that point, but I'm also kind of impressed that we are still talking about Jane Fonda after, you know, the Hanoi Jane thing, as we pointed out in the introduction, half a century ago. So look at that impressive show of salience from Jane Fonda.
Yes, I don't really think of myself as a particularly young man anymore. I'm 36, but I am a little too young to kind of understand what the thing is with Jane Fonda. I know that she was an actress. I couldn't tell you what things she appeared in. I don't really have much familiarity with, and I know she did that tour in North Vietnam and was kind of a useful idiot for the communist propaganda. But
well, or
that's
alternatively making a conscientious objection to a very unjust war that was being pursued in
maybe both.
Asia.
Honestly, probably both.
Look, we're having a pretty good-natured discussion here, but one thing I would say in Jane Fonda's defense of those remarks was, I do think she made an important argument about empathy. And I recall making the same argument to you about Selena Gomez fairly recently, when Selena Gomez was criticized for a very tearful video that she delivered complaining about the plight of immigrant communities. And she was widely mocked and she took the video down. And my point, and Jane Fonda's point, glad to be on the same page as Jane, is that empathy itself is a very useful, noble value to exhibit, and we seem to be in a moment right now where empathy, particularly for the more vulnerable or the more marginalized, gets too easily mocked or derided.
I am in favor of empathy, certainly, but there is already a word for empathy. It's just the word empathy. So to say that empathy and wokeness, I mean, look, words are whatever they are. If you want to define wokeness as just empathy, then fine, we're all in favor of it, but most of the people who use wokeness pejoratively are referring to, as Piers Morgan described, a kind of cultural norms enforcement that I am happy to say has fallen by the wayside a little bit. I think we'll consider the 2015 to 2022 period or whatever, the height of woke enforcement, which involved the bullying, the canceling, the shame, getting people in trouble, people losing their jobs, people losing educational prospects for having said or expressed insensitive sentiments at times. And I don't think it is empathetic to punish people disproportionately to some thought or word-based transgression. That does not actually seem empathetic to me.
The point about the definition of woke is a completely valid one, and I recall a very viral episode of this very show before my tenure, when a previous host asked a conservative commentator to define wokeness, and the answer was
not immediately forthcoming.
Unimpressive, I would say.
Yes.
So look, I think there is a genuine issue here with how you define all these terms. Woke, DEI itself, we have talked about a lot. There is, I think we do agree to some extent that there is at least a separation between seeking the most qualified person for the job, even if that involves expanding one's catchment area into non-traditional areas, let's say, and some of the trainings or whatever that I think, to be fair, we both have some issues with. You know, wokeness is like that. It can mean different things to different people. But Jane Fonda obviously making the argument that people who use it in a disparaging way can in fact simply be disparaging care or compassion or empathy for others.
Well, we shouldn't do that. I always find it interesting that whatever we're referring to had a variety of terms to describe. It was political correctness run amok, cancel culture, intersectionality. There were all these and then the one that won overall was woke, because it is 4 letters long and 1 syllable and easier to say and write than political correctness run amok.
Possibly,
but it's the same thing. That is what people are objecting to.
Well, is it though?
Because
I mean, the idea initially, woke is one of those words that started off with a genuine progressive meaning, which was
like
an awareness of structural inequality, structural racism, and so on and so forth. Things that it is important, I would argue, to have an awareness of. It then got weaponized or got twisted in a different way by people who made it a denigratory label just to mean, I think, excessive identity politics or excessive liberalism. And so I think it can be flung around far too much to discredit things that are in fact worthy and honourable and do seek to address historic inequities that have been created in this country.
It's the enforcement mechanism aspect of it that I object to, which is what takes you out of, in my view, the empathy territory. When you're saying, if you don't share my view or you're not using my language, because they're really concerned with language policing, then you should lose your job, you should be disenrolled from this university, you should not be allowed to speak. Remember all the progressive activists on college campuses, screaming at conservative speakers that they were engaged in hate speech and their words were literal violence and they shouldn't be allowed to speak. That doesn't seem very empathetic to me. You can just think the speaker's wrong or disagree with them, or even do your little polite protest, but actually that person speaking is a violation of my rights to feel free from threats of violence or whatever, which is a made up. You don't have that right vis-a-vis versus somebody's speech. It's the enforcement of that I find to be the objectionable thing of wokeness that people on the right are criticizing.
Look, I believe
just, believing that trans people deserve equal dignity, or Muslim people or Jewish people or whoever.
Look, on somewhere like campuses, there should of course be a free exchange of ideas, and the whole purpose of a quote-unquote liberal education used to be that you tested your own pre-existing views with other people who had different views. There was a dialogue that actually strengthened one's powers of reasoning, even if they changed one's conclusions. I think that's completely valid. I think that conservatives often use the word woke to describe anything that would change society in a more equitable way, in ways that people who have a vested interest in the status quo don't like.
That does it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Take care.